Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and today I'm going to continue this series of videos on Plato's Republic. Today I'm going to start Book 10, and I decided to call this one The Danger of Imitation because Socrates is going to revisit an idea that he brought up all the way back in Book 2, that we should exile the poets from this fictitious city-state. He introduced the idea back then, but a lot has happened between then and now. We've seen the education of the soul. We've seen a healthy soul developed, the idea of justice in the soul. We saw how a healthy person would behave towards themselves and towards others. We saw the divided line where we saw that in the realm of opinion, opinion functions at a lower power than does knowledge. And then we saw the allegory of the cave where we saw that that higher power of knowledge is in that realm of things in themselves or absolute realities. But in our physical world, that's represented by the cave. The things in the cave they are real at their own proper mode of reality, but they're not ultimate reality. And in a sense, you could call them imitations because they're similitudes of the absolute realities. And then we saw books 8 and 9. What happens if you don't have a healthy soul? You either let it go because you don't protect the wisdom that you've gained, or you never gained it in the first place. What are the states of mind of people who have not followed this sort of education? And all of that now brings us here where we're going to revisit the idea of exiling the poets. Only now Socrates can talk about it in a different way. So he starts off by wanting to visit this idea of three realms of reality. Your forms or ideas, what I've been calling absolute realities. Those are the intelligibles in the intelligible realm, the world outside the cave. The physical manifestations in the cave, and then there can be replicas or imitations of the physical manifestations. And so you have these three layers or three levels of reality. Now, there are many different examples that Socrates could have chosen that would have all been valid. He could have looked at humans or animals, plants. He could have looked at anything in nature, mountains and rivers. It would have been more difficult to use a concept like same or difference or equality, but that also would have been valid. Of all the options, which one did he choose? Well, none of the valid ones. What he chose may seem strange at first is a couch, or in some translations called a bed. Now here's a drawing I found of a ancient Greek couch, and you can think of it as the idea in the mind of God. It's a bit poetical, but this is like the absolute reality of bed or couch. And then you can imagine a furniture maker here in the physical world making an actual couch. And then maybe a painter will come along and say, wow, what a great couch. I want to paint that. And there's the couch as a painting. So these three levels. Now the metaphysics here is not quite right, and I don't like this example very much, but I do see a method to his madness. And so as we go on, we'll talk about that some more. But you have these three levels of reality, and then each one has its own creator, if you will, or maker. And all of our translations, as I've been doing throughout the Republic, are from Paul Shorey. And he says, the painter then, the cabinet maker, I mean the furniture maker, maybe an assembly line in China actually, and God. There are these three presiding over three kinds of couches. And Glaucon says that the painter is the imitator of the thing which those others produce. Very good. The producer of the product, three removes from nature, you call the imitator, by all means. So you can see their counting method was different. They include the imitation as one and count from there. So, and that, by the way, that counting method does go throughout the dialogue and other ones. So I think that was just the way they did it in ancient Greece. So that's what he means by three removes. And that's the imitator. Now, I think to tie it in, I think the reason he used a couch instead of something that would have a natural reason principle would be because he wanted that middle term to be a person, and that ties in better with what he wants to say about the poets. So here's where he starts to bring in the poets. Then have we not next to scrutinize tragedy and its leader Homer? Since some people tell us that these poets know all the arts and all things human pertaining to virtue and vice, and all things divine, for the good poet, if he is to poetize things rightly, must, they argue, create with knowledge, or else be unable to create. So we must consider whether these critics have not fallen in with such imitators and been deceived by them, so that looking upon their works, they cannot perceive that these are 3 removes from reality, and easy to produce without knowledge of the truth. For it is phantoms, not realities, that they produce. So in other words, the person who painted the couch was looking at the physical manifestation of couch and doesn't have to know the absolute reality, which doesn't exist. But that is the basic idea here, the basic metaphysics of it. And Socrates is going to go on to explain this further. He asks, does a couch differ from itself according as you view it from the side or the front or in any other way? Or does it differ not at all in fact, though it appears different, and so of other things? That is the way of it. It appears other, but differs not at all. So you look at the couch from different directions. It's the same couch, but it always looks different from different directions. Consider then this very point. To which is painting directed in every case? To the imitation of reality as it is, or of appearance as it appears? Is it an imitation of a phantasm or of the truth? Of a phantasm, he says. And now he's going to go on with Homer. Considering the greatest and finest things of which Homer undertakes to speak, wars and generalship and the administration of cities and the education of men, it surely is fair to question him and ask, Friend Homer, if you are not at the 3rd remove from truth and reality and human excellence, being merely that creator of phantoms, whom we defined as the imitator, but if you are even in the 2nd place and were capable of knowing what pursuits make men better or worse in private or public life, tell us what city was better governed, owing to you. So it's a rather harsh criticism, and I do think it's a little bit disingenuous because Homer's fame was not so much about his ability to describe war or the administration of cities. He was a spiritual man whose fame was really tied to his presentation of mythology. And many people have described his works as the Bible of his day. His writings were like the Bible are for us today. And so there is something a bit disingenuous here. I mean, it's not like we're ever going to make a city based on the Republic, because, he ended the very last chapter saying it doesn't matter if the city's ever created or not. So just as Plato wasn't actually trying to create a city-state, so also Homer wasn't either. So there is something disingenuous in it, but what he's focusing on here, I think, is the aspects that are imitations. If you compare what he's saying here about Homer, to what he says about Homer in the dialogue Eon, then you see something very curious. Eon is one of the early dialogues, and I do have a video on it. I'll link it at the end, so if anyone is interested in seeing that, it is in the playlist for the early dialogues, and I'll link it at the end for you. So if you haven't seen it, you can, or if you want to go back and look at it and remind yourself what it was about, you can do that. But in that dialogue, there Socrates does put Homer in the 2nd place in regards to spiritual matters. But even there, he does poke some fun at Homer, saying things like, if you need a doctor, you need medical advice, would you go to an actual doctor, or would you go to Homer, who wrote about has some scenes in his writings about medical issues? And of course, you'd go to the real doctor. And if you wanted to plan a military campaign, would you talk to a real general, or would you turn to Homer? And again, of course, you turn to the general. And in every case, you would not turn to Homer. So even there we see that Plato was critical of these imitative aspects of Homer's work. And I think that's really what he's focusing on in this section of the Republic, that he's going to focus on those areas of Homer's work. And let's go on to see how he sets this up. He says, the poet himself, knowing nothing but how to imitate, lays on with words and phrases the colors of the several arts in such fashion that others equally ignorant, who see things only through words, will deem his words most excellent, whether he speak in rhythm, meter, and harmony, about cobbling or generalship or anything whatever. So mighty is the spell that these adornments naturally exercise, though when they are stripped bare of their musical coloring and taken by themselves, I think you know what sort of a showing these sayings of the poets make. And then to describe this better, he's going to bring up this idea of three different arts: the user's art, the maker's, and the imitators. Now, the user, you can use any kind of example here, maybe like a musical instrument, and he's going to use flutes as in his example, or it could be, say, a tool like a hammer or an axe or anything at all, even the couch that we had earlier. The person who actually uses it is the one who has knowledge, who knows what is good about this particular instrument, for example, and what improvements could be made to make it better. Now, the maker does not actually use it and so needs that advice and will take that feedback and then have right opinion. So he describes it this way. The one then possessing knowledge reports about the goodness and badness of the flutes, and the other, believing, will make them. Yes. Then in respect of the same implement, the maker will have right belief about its excellence and defects from association with the person who knows, and being compelled to listen to that person. But the user is the one who will have true knowledge. So there's the difference between knowledge and right opinion. The one with knowledge is the one who has experience. And then you can add to that the imitator. The imitator has neither knowledge nor right opinion. And we'll see how that is by looking at the divided line that we saw back in Book 6. Now in Book 6, and I just want to remind you that this is divided in such a way that the lower is to the greater in each section, as the lower is to the greater section's total, and the greater is to the whole. And this equation is called the golden mean, or the golden ratio. Now, in Book 6, we were focused on knowing as being the objects in the intelligible region, or things in themselves. What we're looking at now is a lower level of knowing, a more colloquial way of using the word knowing. And so we can take those headings out, but we'll still find that what we can do now is use this as, say, analogous to what we saw in Book 6. And so what we're seeing here is that the person with knowledge is the one who actually uses the tool or instrument or whatever. So that person has experience. The person with right opinion is looking to the user, much as in the allegory of the cave. The person with understanding was the one who was on that steep incline leading to the exit of the cave. And so that person was focused on the sunlight in the upper world. That person was not yet functioning at a high enough power to actually be in that upper world, but was focused there and was being guided by it. And so that person has right opinion. And remember, B and C are equal in length because they both are belief to some degree, but there is a difference because the maker is looking in this direction, whereas the imitator is not. The imitator is focused here on looking at that image of the couch, the shadow on the wall of the cave, and then just painting that. And so there is a difference between the imitator and the maker in terms of their cognitive functions. And so that's what Socrates was showing there. He says the imitator will neither know nor opine rightly concerning the beauty or the badness of his imitations. Yet still he will nonetheless imitate, though in every case he does not know in what way the thing is good or bad. But as it seems, the thing he will imitate will be the thing that appears beautiful to the ignorant multitude. Poetry, and in general, the mimetic art, that's hard to say, produces a product that is far removed from truth in the accomplishment of its task, and associates with the art in us that is remote from phronesis or intelligence, and is its companion and friend for no sound and true purpose. And just as a reminder, phronesis, as I've mentioned in some past videos, is that power in the soul that allows us to participate in nous, and therefore experience the absolute realities or things in themselves. So we're seeing here that imitation then would be far removed from that. He says our soul at any one moment teems with countless self-contradictions. Shall we not say that the part of us that leads us to dwell in memory on our suffering and impels us to lamentation and cannot get enough of that sort of thing is the irrational and idle part of us, the associate of cowardice? Yes, we will say that. And does not the fretful part of us present many and varied occasions, And does not the fretful part of us present many and varied occasions for imitation, while the intelligent and temperate disposition, always remaining approximately the same, is neither easy to imitate nor to be understood when imitated, especially by a nondescript mob assembled in the theater, for the representation imitates a type that is alien to them, by all means. So the wise person then is difficult to imitate. And for people who are not part of a wisdom tradition, never think of such things, the wise person is difficult to understand. But more ignorant states of mind or less wise states of mind are easier to imitate. They're more extreme in their behavior of highs and lows, and so it's what theater tends to thrive on. Is it not obvious that the nature of the mimetic poet is not related to this better part of the soul, and his cunning is not framed to please it, if he is to win favor with the multitude, but is devoted to the fretful and complicated type of character because it is easy to imitate? It is obvious. And so it's easier to imitate. It's also more entertaining. The mimetic poet sets up in each individual soul a vicious constitution by fashioning phantoms far removed from reality, and by currying favor with the senseless element that cannot distinguish the greater from the less, but calls the same thing now one, now the other, by all means. But we have not yet brought up our chief accusation against it. Its power to corrupt, with rare exceptions, even the better sort. This is surely the chief cause for alarm. How could it be otherwise if it really does that? So now we'll go on to explore this idea. Listen and reflect. I think you know that the very best of us, when we hear Homer or some other of the makers of tragedy imitating one of the heroes who is in grief and is delivering a long tirade in his lamentations, or chanting and beating his breast, we feel pleasure and abandon ourselves and accompany the representation with sympathy and eagerness. And we praise as an excellent poet the one who most strongly affects us in this way. I do know it, of course. Do you think then that this praise is rightfully bestowed when, contemplating a character that we would not accept but would be ashamed of in ourselves, we do not abominate it but take pleasure and approve. No, by Zeus, it does not seem reasonable. And they go on. Socrates says that few are capable of reflecting that what we enjoy in others, we inevitably react upon ourselves. For after feeding fat the emotion of pity there, it is not easy to restrain it in our own sufferings. And so what he's saying here is that what you value is what you're eventually going to act on. It must have some sympathy in your soul. And so part of the reason that he says that we should kick out the poets, and of course that is not literally, but there is a value, he's saying here, to the idea of questioning things like the media and entertainment, things like movies and TV and music, is that we want to look at the states of mind. This is part of music, is looking at states of mind and recognizing. You don't necessarily have to actually cut it out of your life, but recognize the patterns. And of course, in the analogy to the city of the city-state to the soul, we're looking not only at things that are in the city-state, but also what affects us in our soul. The poets in our lives are our parents, our teachers, our societies. So take an example like justice, since that's the topic of the Republic. If you grow up in America, then you learn the value of individualism. But if you grow up in Asia, for example, you may learn more of a group value. And so these societies will have different ideas about justice, what is fair, what is right, how people should treat each other, and what they should expect from one another. And so you see that societies teach us things about our values like justice, and then also our families teach us something in the town that you grow up in. And we're getting all of these patterns in our soul. And we saw in books 8 and 9 the dangers that come with that, and the various ways that they influence us in negative ways sometimes. And also we can even look at our own daydreams. These also are like our own private theater, and they're showing us emotions in our own soul. And if we water those emotions, they just keep growing. And so this is all a danger. These are all things to watch for if you are being musical, as Socrates used that word. He says, so in regard to the emotions of sex and anger and all the appetites and pains and pleasures of the soul, which we say accompany all our actions, the effect of poetic imitation is the same, for it waters and fosters these feelings, when what we ought to do is to dry them up, and it establishes them as our rulers when they ought to be ruled, to the end that we may be better and happier people instead of worse or more miserable. He says that we can admit no poetry into our city save only hymns to the gods and the praises of good men. For if you grant admission to the honey-eyed muse in lyric or epic, pleasure and pain will be lords of your city instead of law, in that which shall from time to time have approved itself to the general reason as the best. And so at this point in the dialogue, we realize that what he's talking about is that pleasure and pain being the lords of our city means being guided by the appetitive part of the soul rather than by the reasoning part of the soul. Even as men who have fallen in love, if they think that the love is not good for them, hard though it be, nevertheless they refrain. So we, owing to the love of this kind of poetry inbred in us by our education in these fine qualities of ours, will gladly have the best possible case made out for her goodness and truth. But so long as she is unable to make good her defense, we shall chant over to ourselves as we listen the reasons that we have given as our countercharm to her spell, to prevent us from slipping back into the childish loves of the multitude. For we've come to see that we must not take such poetry seriously, as a serious thing that lays hold on truth, but that he who lends an ear to it must be on his guard, fearing for the polity in his soul, and must believe that what we have said, and must believe what we have said about poetry. Sorry, I seem to be having trouble reading today. But what he's saying here, you can see, is that if you understand what he said about the healthy soul, then you realize the danger of letting these other states of mind keep hold of us and stay in our soul and have an affinity there. And so even though it may seem a bit harsh to say, cut these things out of our lives, there is a method to this madness. There is a reason for it. And I can tell you from my own experience that there's quite a bit of growth that we can experience while still indulging in movies and so on and being very much a part of society. But I have found as I go on that I just naturally am kind of less interested in such things. And I think it comes quite naturally. It's not like you have to give it up and force yourself to drop it. It's more like it will naturally slip away. And as you see, like in your own daydreams and in your own night dreams, as you start to see the patterns in your own thoughts that are unhealthy, you'll want to get those out. And so it will all happen quite naturally. Glaucon says, by all means, I concur. Yes, for great is the struggle, dear Glaucon, a far greater contest than we think it, that determines whether a man prove good or bad, so that not the lure of honor or wealth or any office, no, nor of poetry either, should incite us to be careless of righteousness and all excellence. And so that brings us to the end of today's video, but what I'm going to do next week is go on to look at what is the value then of dropping this? So if you avoid the danger of imitation, what are the gains of wisdom? And that is going to be that's how Plato ends the dialogue, and that's what I'm going to cover next week. So again, if you have any questions or comments, please drop me an email or put a comment below. And also, as always, I'd appreciate a thumbs up if you like what you saw. And if you don't already subscribe, I hope you'll think about it, because I do put out a new video each week. And then, as always, I hope that you will join me next week. Thank you so much.